North Atlantic, February 1942. Winter closed over the Atlantic like a steel lid. Gray seas heaved endlessly beneath low cloud, and beneath those waters, German U-boats moved in patient formation, engines idling, crews listening to the faint echoes of propellers far above. These wolfpacks did not hunt blindly. They struck where shipping lanes were weakest, where escorts were absent, where convoys had been predicted days in advance. Allied losses mounted relentlessly, and every sinking sharpened the sense that the enemy knew far too much. What no U-boat commander could see was that the war had already shifted away from torpedoes and depth charges toward paper, ink, and emotion. In Britain, far from the spray and steel of the Atlantic, intelligence officers were learning that raw force would not be enough to break the submarine threat. Radio intercepts revealed patterns. Decoded fragments suggested foreknowledge, anticipation, precision. The German Navy trusted its intelligence implicitly, and that trust became the opening. If enemy commanders believed their information was reliable, then the information itself could be turned into a weapon. The solution that emerged was almost absurd in its simplicity. Not codes, not ciphers, but letters. Personal correspondence. Intimate messages that carried no military markings and raised no suspicion. Words written in the language of affection, routine, longing. Messages that looked human enough to slip past scrutiny and dangerous enough to reshape the battlefield. These were not messages meant to be read by lovers. They were meant to be intercepted. British intelligence understood the psychology of German naval command. U-boat captains were meticulous, disciplined, and deeply respectful of intelligence assessments. When a letter surfaced hinting at a convoy delay, a port congestion, or a shipping reroute, especially when it appeared unconnected to military channels, it felt authentic. Real life leaked into strategy. That was the illusion. Slowly, methodically, false personal correspondence began entering neutral postal routes. Some spoke casually of postponed sailings. Others mentioned ships expected next week instead. Nothing overt, nothing alarming, just enough to nudge assumptions, just enough to shift patrol lines by a few degrees, just enough to send submarines into empty seas, while real convoys slipped past under cover of darkness. Out in the Atlantic, wolfpacks adjusted their positions accordingly. They waited where the letters implied opportunity would appear. Fuel burned, batteries drained, days passed with nothing on the horizon. Meanwhile, Allied shipping began surviving crossings that should have been fatal. No alarms sounded, no orders were shouted, no single failure exposed the deception. Instead, confusion spread quietly through German after-action reports. Missed contacts, broken expectations. Commanders blamed weather, timing, chance. The idea that affection-filled letters could be guiding entire submarine formations into the wrong ocean never surfaced. This was warfare without explosions. A battle fought through habits, trust, and human assumption. The Allies had discovered that in a war of machines, the most vulnerable component was still the mind behind them. As winter storms battered the North Atlantic, the real offensive was already underway, written not in codebooks or battle plans, but in sentences designed to feel ordinary. And with every unreadable horizon, and every convoy that vanished into fog, the U-boat menace began to fracture from within. By the early years of the Atlantic War, the balance had tilted dangerously against the Allies. German U-boats were not merely sinking ships. They were dismantling supply systems. Every tanker destroyed meant fuel shortages. Every freighter lost meant factories slowing, armies waiting, and cities tightening ration lines. Britain's survival hinged on ocean traffic, and the ocean had become hostile territory. The strength of the German submarine campaign did not lie only in steel hulls or torpedo tubes. It rested on information. The Kriegsmarine had built a doctrine around intelligence-driven warfare. Patrol zones were assigned based on forecasts, convoy patterns, and predictive analysis. U-boats were not hunters roaming at random. They were guided predators, positioned days in advance where prey was expected to appear. This confidence had been earned. Early successes validated the system. Merchant ships sailed into carefully prepared killing zones. Escorts arrived too late, or not at all. Reports flowing back to German command reinforced the belief that their intelligence picture was accurate, comprehensive, and superior. Opposing this system was an Allied intelligence apparatus evolving under extreme pressure. At its core stood Bletchley Park, where analysts worked relentlessly to penetrate German naval communications. Decrypts provided fragments, patterns rather than certainty. They revealed how much the enemy relied on indirect signals, port rumors, commercial schedules, neutral shipping gossip, and civilian correspondence. The German intelligence ecosystem absorbed everything it could plausibly justify. That realization changed the problem entirely. If intelligence was not confined to encrypted radio traffic, then deception did not need to be confined there either. Traditional naval countermeasures struggled to keep pace. Escort numbers were insufficient. Aircraft coverage had gaps measured in hundreds of miles. New technologies, radar, sonar, improved depth charges, were coming. But slowly, the submarine threat required an immediate solution, something that could work within existing limitations. British planners began studying not just German technology, but German habits. U-boat commanders were trained to trust centralized assessments. They believed in patterns over instincts, reports over hunches. When intelligence suggested opportunity, they obeyed. Even if the sea appeared empty, that discipline, once an advantage, could be inverted. Neutral countries became critical terrain. Letters passing through Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Switzerland carried weight precisely because they were unofficial. Civilian mail felt authentic. It spoke the language of everyday life, not war rooms. Intelligence officers recognized that a carefully placed sentence, routed correctly, could travel farther than any radio transmission and be believed more readily. This approach demanded restraint. Any exaggeration would trigger suspicion. Any technical detail would invite scrutiny. The deception had to feel accidental, incidental, human. It required writers who understood how ordinary people described delays, rumors, and expectations without realizing their words carried strategic implications. As the Atlantic campaign intensified, the Allies quietly prepared a new kind of offensive, one that did not seek to overpower German submarines directly, but to redirect them, to drain their endurance, to fracture their certainty. The coming confrontation would not be marked by explosions or visible clashes. It would unfold invisibly, across desks and mail routes, shaping decisions long before steel ever met water. The first effects were subtle enough to be dismissed. Across the North Atlantic, U-boat commanders began receiving patrol instructions that felt routine, supported by background intelligence that appeared sound. Reports referenced commercial delays, altered shipping expectations, and minor schedule shifts. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. The information aligned neatly with what German analysts already believed they knew. Wolfpacks adjusted course. Submarines spread into designated grid squares, settling into long waits beneath hostile seas. Engines were shut down to conserve fuel. Batteries were rationed carefully. Crews listened through hydrophones for the distant rhythm of merchant propellers that never arrived. Hours passed, then days. At headquarters, the pattern initially raised no alarm. Empty patrols were an accepted risk of submarine warfare. Weather interfered. Convoys altered course. Chance played its role, but as reports accumulated, a quiet inconsistency emerged. Too many patrol zones were proving barren. Too many predicted targets failed to materialize. The deception had begun to bite. Behind the scenes, Allied planners monitored the results with extreme caution. Nothing could appear deliberate. The letters had been designed to influence expectation, not dictate action. Their strength lay in plausibility. Each false hint nudged German assumptions just enough to shape deployment, without triggering doubt. Meanwhile, real Allied convoys were being rerouted through corridors, cleared by absence. Escorts, stretched thin, only weeks earlier, found themselves guarding ships that encountered no opposition. Survivability rates began to improve, not dramatically, but measurably. Tonnage losses dipped in places where they had been expected to spike. German commanders responded in predictable ways. Some extended patrols, burning fuel in widening search patterns. Others shifted depth, changed timing, or blamed local conditions. The idea that their intelligence inputs themselves were compromised remained unthinkable. The system had worked too well for too long. Radio traffic reflected mounting uncertainty. Analysts at Bletchley Park observed subtle changes in language, questions about timing, requests for confirmation, recalculations of convoy speed. The enemy was not panicking, but the certainty that had once guided operations with confidence was eroding. Crucially, no single failure exposed the trap. The letters did not point to specific convoys. They did not promise guaranteed targets. They created expectations that repeatedly went unmet. In warfare, repeated disappointment is corrosive. It drains morale, consumes resources, and undermines trust in command structures. U-boats began returning to port, with fewer engagements to report. Fuel consumption rose, mechanical strain increased. Crews endured longer patrols with diminishing results. The operational tempo that had once favored Germany began to stall, not because of Allied firepower, but because German submarines were being positioned where the war was no longer happening. By the time senior officers began reviewing patterns at a strategic level, the damage was already embedded in routine. The wolfpacks were chasing shadows shaped by ink and paper, while the real war moved quietly around them. The first contact had not been an explosion or a sinking. It had been absence, and absence, repeated often enough, was beginning to reshape the Atlantic battlefield. By the time the strain became impossible to ignore, it was no longer a question of missed convoys. It was a question of endurance. U-boat patrols grew longer as commanders attempted to compensate for failure. Boats stayed at sea past optimal limits, stretching fuel margins and draining batteries deeper than doctrine recommended. Mechanical issues multiplied under constant strain. Diesel engines fouled by salt. Electrical systems weakened by repeated deep submersions. Crews pushed into exhaustion by weeks of alertness without contact. The Atlantic did not forgive mistakes made in fatigue. German command responded by tightening control. Patrol grids were reassigned more frequently. Boats were ordered to reposition mid-mission, sometimes crossing hundreds of miles, based on revised intelligence assessments. Each correction burned fuel. Each adjustment reduced operational life. The system that had once maximized efficiency was now consuming itself. Allied intelligence watched the escalation carefully. The deception had reached a dangerous phase. Push too hard, and patterns might be questioned. Ease off too soon, and the U-boats might recover their footing. The solution was balance, maintaining the illusion of credibility, while allowing pressure to build organically. Letters continued to circulate, but more sparsely. Their content shifted subtly. Instead of promising opportunity, they suggested uncertainty. Delays without explanation. Cargoes rescheduled quietly. The implication was not deception, but chaos. Exactly what German analysts already believed. Allied logistics were suffering. At sea, the effect was cumulative. Wolfpacks arrived late to former hunting grounds only to find them empty. Escorts encountered fewer submarines, not because the threat had vanished, but because it had been mispositioned. Air patrols began spotting isolated U-boats operating beyond optimal zones, vulnerable and alone. Losses followed. Submarines damaged while attempting to relocate. Boats forced to abort patrols due to fuel miscalculations. Crews returning to port without results. Their confidence eroded by a sense that the ocean itself had turned unpredictable. Commanders began questioning their own judgment, even as they continued to trust the intelligence that shaped it. This psychological fracture marked the true breaking point. Once doubt entered the operational mindset, decisiveness suffered. Attacks were delayed, opportunities second-guessed. Aggression softened into caution. In submarine warfare, hesitation was lethal. The Allies did not announce victory. There was no singular moment of triumph. But shipping graphs told the story clearly. Survival rates rose, replacement losses stabilized. The Atlantic supply line, once near collapse, began to hold. German command would later search for causes in technology, weather, and Allied escort improvements. Rarely did they consider the possibility that their own expectations had been engineered against them. That trust, carefully cultivated, quietly manipulated, had guided entire fleets into strategic exhaustion. The wolfpacks had not been destroyed outright. They had been worn down, redirected, and mentally unmoored. And by the time new realities were acknowledged, the initiative had already slipped away. The Atlantic War did not end with a single revelation. There was no captured document that exposed the deception. No confession extracted from an intelligence officer. No dramatic collapse of German naval doctrine. Instead, the truth dissolved into the background noise of a losing campaign. As Allied shipping losses declined and convoy survival rates stabilized, German naval leadership searched for explanations that fit familiar frameworks. New Allied aircraft, improved escort tactics, radar refinements, and sheer industrial output all appeared to offer sufficient answers. Each was real, each played a role, none on its own explained how entire U-boat formations had spent critical months hunting where the war no longer was. The correspondence operations faded quietly. Once their purpose had been served, the letters stopped. No correction was required. The battlefield had already moved on. Post-war analysis revealed the deeper significance of what had occurred. The deception succeeded not because it was brilliant, but because it was believable. It exploited a foundational assumption of intelligence work, that information appearing ordinary, human, and unofficial was often the most truthful. German analysts had trusted civilian signals precisely because they seemed unstructured and unguarded. That trust reshaped the campaign. By forcing submarines to operate on false expectations rather than false orders, the Allies avoided triggering suspicion. U-boats were not commanded into traps. They navigated into emptiness, fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and declining morale followed naturally. Strategic advantage shifted without a visible battle line ever being drawn. The legacy of the operation extended far beyond the Atlantic. It reinforced a doctrine that intelligence warfare did not require domination of enemy systems, only influence over enemy decisions. The mind, once nudged in the wrong direction, could do the rest. Future intelligence planners would study this period closely, not as a triumph of code breaking alone, but as proof that deception worked best when it felt accidental, when it blended seamlessly into the texture of everyday life, when it exploited habits rather than defied them. Some of the U-boat threat did not vanish overnight, but it never regained the clarity, confidence, or momentum it once possessed. The wolfpacks continued to sail, continued to fight, but no longer with certainty, and in war, uncertainty is often the beginning of defeat. In the end, the Atlantic was not saved by a single weapon or tactic. It was saved by patience, restraint, and the quiet manipulation of expectation, by letters never meant to be answered, written for eyes that were never supposed to realize they were being addressed at all. The most decisive blows of the campaign were never heard, only felt, slowly, as the ocean grew quieter.